Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about Manaless champions and how I feel that they are ultimately a very poor design and bad for the health of League of Legends overall, even though that they've been in the design of League of Legends since the very beginning. Since Bel'Veth is a Manaless champion, and one that I feel like is not very well done, and one that should not have been Manaless, I think this is a good time to have this discussion about why, even though sometimes Manaless champions are a necessary evil, Riot should really be working as hard as possible to limit the number of Manaless champions that exist in the game, especially given that it feels like we're getting quite a few of these over the last few years. Now, the biggest reason for this is Manaless champions break the game in a few different ways, and I think a few very important ways. League of Legends as a game is sort of designed around the concept of having to manage resources, that whether that's your health or, for example, your mana. A lot of times League of Legends comes down to be less of a sprint and more of a marathon, in which you sort of need to be cautiously evaluating how much health you have, how much mana you have, what cooldowns you have available to you, and most of this is done in lane, of course, but I think that there are a lot of times later in the mid-game or late-game periods where that still becomes a process, where you can't contest a Baron because your jungler was chunked low in a previous fight, or where you can't stay to continue to push out a lane because you were out of mana and no longer have the ability to deal effective damage to minions. A lot of League of Legends is sort of based around this concept and is sort of structured in such a way as to rely on this. A lot of the tension of laning phase is the constant management of your resources to say, do I still have the ability to fight my opponent at a moment's notice? Even if I have a lot of health, if I have no mana, I have no ability to fight them effectively if I'm a champion like a mage. Conversely, some champions are able to get away less with mana, but it's still important, right? A Draven, for example, doesn't necessarily need his mana, but it can be extremely helpful for things like Blood Rush or Stand Aside if he absolutely needs it, in addition to an ultimate, which is going to consume a large percentage of his mana bar, should it come to that. And Manaless champions break this. Right? They don't have to worry about this constant drain on a resource that they end up needing. They don't have to worry about what using a cooldown, expending mana to catch CS, for example, that they would otherwise miss, might mean for them in the future, because, of course, they're not spending anything for it. All they're spending is a cooldown, which, admittedly, is something that every champion needs to manage, but every champion with mana has to manage not only their cooldowns, but also their resource drain. Resourceless champions only have to worry about their cooldown management. So there's an additional layer of thought that mana champions require that Manaless champions don't. And effectively, this means that their threat level is almost always 100%. Even if they're low on health, they always have access to their entire kit at any given moment, versus a mana champion who may have everything off cooldown, but may never have the mana necessary to use it. The other issue with Manaless champions, of course, is their interactions with the item system. Oftentimes, mana champions have to make hard decisions about how they want to itemize based on the needs of their resource. Most mages, for example, go Lost Chapter as their first item, but this may not necessarily be what they want. Some mages, for example, may want to go Seeker's Arm Guard if they're up against a powerful AD assassin like Zed. Others may want to go with a Verdant Barrier to deal with poke-heavy AP champions in the mid lane, or maybe they just want to get going on damage immediately and try to rush Deathcap like at Season 2. Either way, though, these champions are having to make a decision based on their needs, right? If I go Seeker's Arm Guard, I'm going to have more damage and more survivability, but less mana overall for me to potentially protect myself with, which is better. I do feel like this has sort of fallen off in recent years with how Lost Chapter has just become a staple for mid lane mages, but it still exists as a potential point of choice, and even tanks have to make this decision, and some bot laners as well, making a decision to go Tear the Goddess or Essence Reaver as an early item to help compensate for their mana needs, in comparison to some other champions that don't have to worry about that, namely Manaless champions, who are able to just buy whatever they want off the bat because they don't have a resource to concern themselves with. And for those of you saying, yeah, but Manaless champions can't buy items with mana. They can. In fact, there were a lot of situations in which champions like Riven or Tryndamere were buying Essence Reaver, even back when it was a very strictly speaking mana-generating item, right? You were purchasing a stat you could not use, they were still buying it because the overall stat package and passive of Essence Reaver were just so well suited towards them that they were fine with surrendering some gold for a stat they can't get use out of. What this means is that mana items are not non-options for Manaless champions, instead they are opt-in. a Manaless champion, for example, who decides they really want the passive of Frozen Heart and all of its armor, could still buy it, even though they can't make use of the mana, but because it's still going to be a useful item and will give them stats that they care about. Now, obviously, this gets less and less relevant depending on the amount of gold you're spending on a certain stat that you can't use, but the point still stands that Manaless champions have just significantly fewer decisions when they have to consider what their build paths are going to look like. And I think that generally Riot knows this, and generally Riot has been okay with this and tries to make champions that have mana when and if possible. I think that there are some examples in recent years even about Riot making champions manaless because they needed to do so from a counterplay standpoint, which is generally when Riot tend to do this. Viego, for example, was designed as a manaless champion, not because of his Q, or not because Riot decided they wanted him to be somehow a broken champion, but because they wanted to clarify Viego's interactions when he possesses other champions. If Viego had mana, for example, and possessed a champion with mana, well, do I keep my own mana? Do I use this champion's mana? Do I get full mana? Do my abilities cost nothing, but when I come back to my real body, I have my mana again at whatever percentage it was at? What if I possess an energy champion? Do my abilities still cost energy, or do they cost mana? How does this work? For Viego to have 0 resource, it becomes readily apparent exactly what his relationship is with that resource and with that champion that he's possessing, and therefore it works from the perspective of balance and ability to tell what Viego's exact situation is. In a similar fashion, Set, who is another recent Manaless champion, I think is another one that works well due to the counterplay that is needed for his W. It is very important for champions to know, basically at all periods of time, exactly what Set's Haymaker is going to do for him. To be able to look at him with a low bar and say, I don't really care about taking this, I can definitely eat this Haymaker if it means continuing to deal damage to Set, versus taking a much more powerful Haymaker. For those of you who would argue Set has the screen flash that would indicate how strong his Haymaker is, that just indicates maximum strength, but not necessarily a powerful Haymaker versus a weak Haymaker. It's very relevant, I think, to have that on deck for champions to be able to see, for them to be able to recognize how much this Haymaker will hurt versus another one, and to then be able to take action accordingly. That said, though, there have been some champions of late that I feel don't actually need to be manaless that have been made manaless regardless. Bel'Veth is one of them. I think that there is no reason for her to be manaless. I think that even though she has a very low cooldown ability with Void Surge, that we've had champions with low cooldown abilities that do cost mana, Ezreal Mystic Shot or Karthus Lay Waste as an example, that are able to have mana, and that means that they still have to pace themselves and their ability usage. Bel'Veth in particular, I think, really could have used mana because, as it turns out, she doesn't actually even have an ultimate to activate, so her mana constraints are significantly lower. She easily could have had mana, and Riot basically decided they didn't want to give it to her for essentially no reason. While they do use her sort of tool, or her resource bar to indicate how many attacks she has boosted from her passive, I feel like that's sort of a waste. Basically, that space that Riot says, we're going to give this, we're going to use it for something because it's there, but there's essentially no reason for it to be there. Bel'Veth easily could have had mana, and if they were really intent on giving her the ability to say, hey, you need mana, but we also want to track your boosted auto attacks, they could have done that in a third bar underneath their health bar, similarly to Corki Missile Barrage, for example. Yone is actually another champion that I feel should have had mana. I know Riot were trying to make Yasuo 2.0, and Yasuo is manaless, I think with good reason, actually, and I can talk more about that guy if you guys are interested, but Yone, I feel like, should have had mana. The only thing that you are tracking with Yone in his resource bar is the duration he has remaining on Soul Unbound. And I don't feel like that's a good enough explanation. I think that generally you don't care how long he has maximum, especially given that Yone himself has an audible warning as to when he has to return. And so, again, it's a situation where Riot is using that resource bar for something, but it's not a good enough reason for me to say that this champion should be manaless. And I think that, in general, that's sort of my issue, is that there are a lot of champions that are manaless in the game who have sort of adverse effects on the game. I think we can all think about a champion like Gnar, for example, and his dominance of top lane, or Renekton and his dominance of top lane, and these sort of other champions that have the ability of playing this really paced game where they know eventually they will win out on resources, and I don't think that's very good design for League of Legends as a whole, especially in high numbers. I think that when it was a sort of one-off, this is a specific thing that this champion is doing that no other champion does, things like Rumble's Heat, for example, or Rengar's Ferocity, I think that that's more okay. But increasingly, there are enough champions that are being added that are manaless that I get concerned about the overall direction the game is taking and how champions that do have mana feel a little left out in the cold when compared to the ever-encroaching numbers of these champions that don't have mana, that don't have resources to worry about, who are able to sort of run roughshod over the rest of the game. But that's kind of my assumption about things. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts if you think Manaless champions are totally fine and should have zero worries whatsoever about how they work. I'd love to hear it. If you guys think that there is a better explanation for it, let me know that down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.